Jake stood on the side of the outer wall of the house, messing with his wrist. He processed everything that was going on and eventually walked around to ease out his thoughts. The feeling of the soft wind brushing against his skin helped relax his body. The sounds of birds chirping and the water in the distance reminded Jake of the first time he met Kari in the glimmering forest. Almost letting his emotions get to him, he began to tear up at the precious memories they had together. He knelt near a tree and sat against it, trying to release all tension in his muscles. A bird flew down to his shoulder, quickly adjusting itself. Jake slightly turned to look at it, moving his hand to hold it better. "What about you, little one?" Jake spoke quietly. "Are you in trouble like I am?" The bird slightly tilted his head to the side and pecked at its own wings, lightly lifting each. Jake smiled and laughed, watching the bird tidy itself. It was a light brown and with white. The feathers sparkled in the sunlight. Jake watched the bird fly away, back to the tree it came from. He put his arm down and let out a long, tiring sigh. After a while, Jake went back to the house and continued to look after Kari. For days on end, he tended to her wound, regardless of what may have been going on at the castle. He avoided to remind himself that he was a prince who may have gone missing or even pronounced to be dead by then. Days went to months. He'd finally seen that Kari's wound fully healed, yet she still did not wake up. About a year had passed even later, still waiting for her to regain consciousness. His hair had grown longer as well, about down to his shoulders. The long waiting came to an end as Kari had finally woken up on a carriage ride. In the back of a wagon, she had woken up dazed in thought. Looking around, she noticed there were only bags and packages next to her, as a driver handled the leads of 2 horses. He wore a dark blue hooded cloak, looking at his back. Confused as to why she was in a carriage on the road, she tried to speak but stopped herself for a moment. She realized that they were right next to a forest on their left, and a large lake was seen nearby on the right. The view was beautiful, and the carriage was coming to a slow stop. Kari held herself onto the side and watched as the man gently pulled back at the horses. Once settled, he quickly stepped off and walked to each, feeding and petting them as if they were his children. His face wasn't shown because of a piece of cloth that was attached to his hood, but she saw the blonde beard and simply stared at the unique shine it had given off in the sunlight. The man realized that he was being stared at and slowly turned toward Kari. "Oh, hello." Kari slightly jumped and waved at the man. The man had no response and simply walked away, taking a bucket with him. Kari looked at him head toward the large lake. She thought of following him, but she could barely attempt to move her legs. Not too long after, though, she managed and lightly stepped off the carriage wagon. Looking down to her hands and feet, she was wearing a short pink dress with knee-high white boots. Her hair felt oddly longer, and she remembered and moved it over her shoulder, realizing it went down to her knees. Walking slowly, she took in the fresh air as her legs happened to move on their own. Kari tried to think back at what she may have been doing beforehand, but everything was a blur. She'd seen the man from afar sitting on a stone, washing his hands with the water in the bucket. Walking over, she sat down on another stone next to him. Kari turned to face him and looked at his pale hands, only for a second. He quickly took in his right hand with his cloak, putting on a glove to cover it. "I'm sorry, I just wanted to ask." Kari realized he looked uncomfortable, and she turned away. The man spoke in a low tone, almost shallow. "You can ask." "Oh." Kari slightly glanced over at him. "What happened? I cannot remember anything that may coordinate with this moment." "I found you wounded, took care of you." The man slowly turned to face her, still half of his face covered. "And I waited about 2 years until you finally woke up." 2? Kari realized that much time had passed. Where are we?" The man turned away, rising to stand. "The northeast outskirts of the great capital." Kari trailed him walking and picking up the bucket. He dumped out the water around a bush and refilled it in the lake again. He may have worn a full cloak and hid his face, but he had not given off any attention to harm Kari. She felt oddly safe around him, sensing he would do nothing but be around. They went back to the carriage wagon, and Kari helped herself get inside the back. She'd seen the man at the horses again, giving them each some water from the bucket. The man lightly tugged at the horses to get them moving again. They went along a smooth trail that rarely had any rocks to bump on the way. Kari laid down to look up at the sky, and it was clear. There were barely any clouds, only the light blue layer of the atmosphere. The sun had been beaming bright, but not too hot. It was quite cool weather, almost perfect. Kari felt the light breeze pass over as the wagon moved, though there was a sudden slow stop and Kari began to sit up, holding the edge to look around again. The bags around cushioned her body, avoiding any excess movement. "State your purpose entering the city of Groylands." A voice came from behind. Kari moved and looked at the man in the cloak being questioned. He took out something from under his cloak, holding it out to a guard. It seemed to be a piece of carved wood attached to his neck by a dark string. The guard waved by and walked off. Then the wagon started to slowly move again. Kari continued to hold herself in place, seeing the tall and wide stone wall. Slowly, sounds of voices grew louder, and crowds of people were seen walking around. Kari crawled over to the side where the man sat in front, trying not to disturb him. "Excuse me, but..." Kari asked, lightly pulling at his cloak. "Where are we going right now?" The man took a quick glance behind and looked ahead. "To a couple of merchant stops throughout the city." Kari slightly pouted at the vague response and continued to look around. She noticed that the buildings were tall and wide. The architecture looked almost professional. There were young ladies laughing and sitting together, even young men in groups playing around. Kari had noticed that they were wearing uniforms, and there was a school bell ringing. though the wagon took a turn and Kari tilted to the side, unprepared. Into her view came a back door from a purple-tiled building, and the wagon slowly stopped again. End of section 19.